The geochemical reactions that take place in the Earth's surface environment are numerous. But in this programme, we've chosen to narrow down the field by illustrating some of the key processes that take place during the evolution of carbon-rich sedimentary rocks. Carbon's about the 12th most abundant element in the Earth's continental crust, less than 0.5% by weight. Yet beneath these Nottinghamshire fields, the top kilometre of the crust contains over 5% of carbon, some of which is very valuable. This area is well known as Britain's most productive coalfield, but far fewer people will know that it's also one of our most important onshore oil fields. Of course, oil and coal are among the more obvious forms of sedimentary carbon, but although the rocks beneath my feet have much greater concentrations of carbon than the crustal average, not all of it's in these two forms. The rocks immediately below here are these red, pebbly desert sandstones of Triassic age, about 200 million years old. But they contain very little carbon. Deep boreholes and shafts that penetrate down through these sandstones eventually encounter carboniferous rocks, about 350 million years old, and they contain much more carbon. By examining well logs and cores, we can build up a picture of carbon distribution and eventually its concentrating mechanisms in the crust. But first, where did the carbon come from originally? Well, this core of dolerite, which comes from a sill about 1,000 metres below the surface, one of its baked margins here, this core reminds us that most of the carbon that's found at the surface originally came from the deep interior as carbon dioxide gas associated with magmatic activity. But how did the carbon dioxide get fixed into solid rocks? Well, as you've probably realised, coal is probably the easiest example to consider. This coal seam consists of compressed plant remains. The photosynthetic activities of these plants converted atmospheric CO2 into cellulose-bound carbon, mainly carbohydrates. The plants grew in the mud bottoms of the carboniferous swamps, where they put down long root systems forming this seat earth. The carbonaceous streaks that you can see represented the fossilized remains of the root systems. Subsequent biological decay, followed by diagenetic processes such as thermal decay and burial, have progressively enriched the carbon content of these deposits as the more volatile material was squeezed out. And that's a very effective process. Whereas peat and woody tissue have about 50 or 60% carbon, this anthracite contains up to about 95% carbon. And of course, plant material like this and much finer organic debris became incorporated into the sediments between the coal seams. And so the carbon content of the whole coal measure sequence varies from just a few percent in places up to nearly 100%. Now, some 200 metres below the lowest coal seam in this area, there's a 500-metre thick sequence of lower carboniferous rocks in which carbon occurs in a completely different form. These limestones, for example, contain about 10% carbon, mainly in the form of fossil debris. Large shell fragments or finely ground shell debris become incorporated in a chemically precipitated calcium carbonate matrix. The animals secreted their calcium carbonate shells by extracting dissolved calcium and bicarbonate ions from seawater, illustrating the point that much of the volcanogenic carbon dioxide in the surface environment at any one time is dissolved, mainly as bicarbonate ions in the oceans, ultimately to become fixed into sedimentary rocks. As you know, a series of chemical equilibrium reactions across the atmosphere-ocean surface, within the ocean and across the ocean bottom surface, control the amount of carbon in each environment. So coal and limestone concentrate carbon in quite different ways. And what about this stuff? This liquid hydrocarbon, or crude oil, contains quite a lot of air and water. When it's settled out, it looks a bit like this. But even so, it contains very little visible clue as to its origin. And the rock from which it's being pumped looks like this. It's a coarse-grained, gritty sandstone containing quartz and felspar grains, but not very much carbonate. Of course, this rock couldn't have contributed to the origin of the oil, which must have migrated here, having been squeezed out of some more hydrocarbon-enriched source. Although we tend to regard oil as a dwindling resource, it's not really that rare a mineral. Yet somehow, geochemical and biological processes must have operated to concentrate by several hundred times the carbon content of the crust to produce this now precious resource. But how? Let's see what clues we can find to this process.
The best place to start is with oil itself. Crude oil is a complex mixture of substances, and an obvious step in understanding oil formation will be to separate out individual components and examine them. And I'm going to concentrate on one rather minor but very important constituent. Now, this stuff is rather gooey and sticky. And it's easier to manage it if you first dissolve it up in solvent, mix it with powdered alumina, and then evaporate off the solvent. And you get a powder that's much easier to handle. What's happened is that the oil's been adsorbed onto the alumina particles, and that has the effect of providing a vastly increased surface area so that the oil reacts more rapidly with solvents. Now, this colorless solvent is methanol. And I'll just warm that a little in some hot water. And what we're after is the red pigment that's giving that very slightly pink color to this solution. Now, there's a much more elegant and convenient way of doing all that, and that's by repeatedly refluxing the methanol through the powder that's held in this white container here. And you get a nice pink solution at the bottom. And here's a little of it. Here's a little of the pink solution. Now, in this tube, there's water with a toluene layer floating on the top. And that effect is, I think, quite pretty. What's happened is that the methanol's gone into the water and the red pigment has gone into the toluene. Now, we can separate off that floating toluene layer, clean it up by removing any traces of water, and here it is, like that. Now, this is a small chromatography column. This is the column. It's packed with minute silica spheres, and they can selectively adsorb organic molecules in solutions that are passed through the column. And now here's my cleaned up toluene solution. That may need helping through a little bit, but it's working quite well. And it's working beautifully. What's happening is that the red pigment is concentrating into a layer near the top of the column, and the other constituents are ending up lower down. And so here's a way of isolating the red pigment. Now, when this pigment was first isolated from oil in the 1930s, it caused a good deal of excitement, and a lot of work's been done on it since. But nowadays, extractions like the one you've just seen are done by machines a bit like this one. The technique is high-pressure liquid chromatography, and it can be used to identify a whole range of organic compounds in oil. Again, you've got a column packed with minute silica spheres. Solvent under high pressure drives the sample down the column, separating it into individual components. And as those components leave the column, a beam of light passes through them to a photoelectric detector cell. The signals from that cell produce a trace on a chart recorder. And this is one of those traces, and it can be used to identify individual components. The red pigment from our oil corresponds with this peak. It's a vanadyl porphyrin, a complex organic molecule with a vanadyl group in the center. And now look at this structure. That's the green pigment chlorophyll that's found in all plants. The two structures are pretty similar, and it's known that chlorophyll can alter to vanadyl porphyrin. but the presence of porphyrins like this in oil strongly suggests a plant origin. And several lines of evidence point to marine plants as a source for the vast majority of oils. But there's only one type of plant that's been present in the oceans of the past in big enough numbers to produce the present known oil reserves. Plankton. There are thousands upon thousands of tiny unicellular plants in every cubic meter of seawater in the surface layers of all the oceans. They consist of three main components: proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. All three organic compounds could give rise to petroleum compounds, but it's the lipids or the fats which are thought to be the main producers. So let's see how it happens. Most plankton live in the thin photic zone of the oceans, the top few tens of meters, where they convert CO2 into sugar by photosynthesis. When they die, they start the slow downward passage towards the ocean floor. Many don't reach the bottom because they've been gobbled up by zooplankton and larger scavengers. The fate of those that do reach the bottom depends on the prevailing conditions. In a high-energy environment, rich in oxygen, dead plants and animals are rapidly broken down or digested by bottom-living bacteria, with the products escaping to the oceans. Plankton which sink into quieter zones stand a much better chance of inclusion in the fine sediments on the sea floor. If they survive their journey to the bottom intact, they become covered by clay particles and other debris, where the sediment supply is adequate. In the uppermost layers of marine sediments, aerobic bacteria act to break down any organic tissue, producing carbon dioxide and water. If only small numbers of plankton reach the sea floor, this process will destroy them all, and no organic carbon will be preserved in the sediments. The numbers of bacteria living in the sediments decrease rapidly with depth. But if the numbers of plankton are large, then they won't all be consumed by the aerobic bacteria, and they'll get buried deeper. This is reflected in the way the percentage of carbon present in average marine sediments also decreases with depth. What's more, as the oxygen content of the sediments decreases, the aerobic bacteria are replaced by anaerobic varieties, and they also decompose organic tissue, producing hydrogen sulfide and more carbon dioxide. If the sediment supply in a particular area is constant, then the depth of burial for each individual plankton increases, and in time the depth will be such that the temperatures increased significantly. At temperatures greater than about 10 degrees centigrade, fermentation takes place in the organic debris, giving methane and carbon dioxide. And this process continues as depth of burial and temperature increase. The resultant gas has a more difficult passage away from the debris because the surrounding sediments being compacted, water is being expelled, and the permeability is reduced. Fermentation is the last of the true biological processes that occur as pressure and temperature increase with time. The planktonic debris is degraded to amorphous, yellowish, brown globules of material called kerogen. This substance consists of complex, long hydrocarbon chains. The relatively high temperatures cause certain of these long chains to break off and to leave the structure. And that gives rise also, for the first time in this process, to hydrocarbons of the kind which are found in petroleum. The first true petroleum products of this process are the heavy oils. As the temperature continues to rise, or even if the same temperature is maintained over longer periods, the kerogen breaks down further into hydrocarbons of lower molecular weight. If conditions are right, the kerogen will continue producing until only the shortest and simplest hydrocarbons, such as methane, are released. And finally, all the hydrocarbons have gone and only graphite remains. So the debris from floating unicellular plants gives rise to oil, provided the conditions are right and there's enough time. Depth of burial is a key factor in determining what sort of hydrocarbons, if any, are going to be formed from organic carbon, which is trapped in the sediments. Now, some components in the original plant material will resist change and stay more or less unaltered down to considerable depths. The geochemical fossils. For instance, waxes similar to those on some leaves can be recognized in many petroleums. Now, gas is produced at all depths as plants break down. At the surface, there's quite a lot of bacterially derived gas. Slightly greater depths, rather less gas is produced by fermentation. But at greater depths, vast quantities of gas are produced from stripping off of the kerogen structure because of the higher temperatures down here. And also down here, we've got the subdivision into gas, which contains a certain amount of evaporated long-chain hydrocarbons, which condense when the gas is brought to the surface, and that's why it's called wet gas, and pure methane, dry gas. The production of oil is restricted to this sort of window between about 1 and 4 kilometers depth, and there's an optimum depth at around 2.5 kilometers. If you go much deeper than that, a higher percentage of the oil will be broken down to gas, and up here at shallower depths, the kerogen won't be altered sufficiently. But that's actually only part of the story, because these reactions we've been looking at, these reactions depend on time as well as on temperature. This graph shows you the broad relationship between those two parameters. Oil will form at temperatures of between about 60 and 120 degrees centigrade. But if a sediment rich in organic matter is buried only deep enough to reach 60 degrees centigrade, it'll need to be at that depth for around 200 million years or so for oil to form. But if it reaches a depth where temperatures are over 100 degrees centigrade, then perhaps only 10 million years might be needed for oil to form. Well now, this summary diagram is based on information from oil reservoirs from all over the world. And these are the two important boundaries. This lower boundary is the limit of oil formation. And this one is the threshold above which higher hydrocarbons are broken down to methane and to other gaseous hydrocarbons. Now, both those boundaries depend on temperature mainly, but time is also important. And in practice, it's both temperature and time that decide where oil is going to be found. Now, here's a west to east cross-section through the Paris Basin with a greatly exaggerated vertical scale. This yellow layer represents marine shales of Jurassic age, at something like 160 million years old. And the fossil remains in that shale indicate that they were all deposited in the same type of environment and water depth. And the whole thing was later gently downwarped in the alpine orogeny. Now, the shales in the center of the basin are now at a depth of 2.5 kilometers. And of course, at the western and eastern ends of the basin, those same shales are at the surface. Now, in shales collected at the surface, there's no kerogen mature enough to have produced oil. But specimens of shale drilled from down here are oil-rich. Well now, the shales are all of the same age, and they almost certainly contain similar amounts of organic debris originally. So the principal reason why there's oil down here and no oil up here must have to do with temperature. Well, so much for the conditions that are necessary to turn organic material into oil. But the most important control on whether or not you're going to get any oil at all is right back at the start with the plankton. This map shows that the production of carbon fixed by photosynthesis varies considerably across the oceans. Lots of other organisms feed on plankton, so sizable amounts of dead plankton reach the bottom only where production is greatest. But even if the supply is large, there may be enough aerobic bacteria on the bottom to consume all the organic material reaching it. So the percentage of organic carbon in the bottom sediments also varies considerably. For instance, Off the coast of Peru, ocean currents bring nutrient-rich waters to the surface. Those nutrients feed vast populations of plankton, and when they die and sink to the bottom, they're attacked by aerobic bacteria. But there's so much dead plankton that nearly all the available oxygen is used up. At about half a kilometre depth, there's less than 0.5 of a part per thousand of oxygen in the water. Water on the continental shelf is anoxic, and organic-rich sediments there can have as much as 11% of organic carbon in them. And the organic material in these anoxic sediments will stand a good chance of becoming kerogen. This is just one example. In other environments, different sets of conditions can lead to the same result. At present, marine areas where the organic carbon content in bottom sediments exceeds 2% are rare. But high concentrations are needed if any of the organic material is to stand a chance of becoming potentially oil-forming kerogen. So the vast biomass produced in the photic zones of the oceans doesn't all reach the sediments. Only in particular environments are we going to get conditions suitable for enough carbon to get into the sediments and form oil. Now we know that the oceans and continents have changed their configurations and relative positions through geological time. So if similar ocean floor environments with high organic carbon contents existed in the past, then an understanding of plate tectonics may help to predict the location of ancient examples, now hidden below more recent sediments. But even if we could find such locations, that's only the first stage in finding oil, because any oil that forms has to migrate into reservoir rocks with a suitable porosity, and it's got to be held there by some sort of geological trapping mechanism. And only a rather small proportion of oil gets into suitable traps. If this sphere were to represent the total amount of organic carbon in sediments, then this ball would represent the amount of carbon in economic oil reservoirs.
Small though this Nottinghamshire oil field may be, it's produced millions of gallons of oil since it was first exploited in the 1950s. Every stroke of the pump provides another gallon. And in our hydrocarbon-dependent society, we need the results of geochemical investigations of known oil-bearing sedimentary basins to help the oil industry to find new reserves. Thus, it's important to complete a thorough analysis of the sedimentary environments of a potential oil-bearing region to establish from the types of sedimentary rock present that the criteria for oil formation are present. These criteria are first that the time-temperature conditions lie within the necessary limits, and secondly that suitable anoxic conditions for oil-prone kerogen development and preservation are maintained during diagenesis. Remember that anoxic reducing conditions and high sedimentation rates are favourable for oil formation because they inhibit the bacterial oxidation of organic debris. Finally, of course, geophysical methods are used to define and detect the limits of oil-bearing structures. Some of these techniques will be illustrated in the next programme, and we'll show you how they're used to determine the best place to drill